You know, there's nothing really worse than wanting a sequel to a game and not knowing if it's even in development. Every so often we play a game that we absolutely fall in love with, leaving us with just one question: when's the next one coming? And even if the developers do announce a game they're working on, there's no guarantee that it'll be good. Of course, some companies have built up a reputation for either good or bad releases. For example, we all know that for the most part, Rockstar doesn't miss. That being said, it takes a very long time for their games to come out. Basically, one game per console generation. Oftentimes, this wait is worth it since these games have an endless amount of content and enjoyment to be had. On the opposite side of things, there's also a few companies who spam out games every year in an effort to maximize profits. These are your sports games and your Call of Duties. Personally speaking, I really hate this way of releasing games, especially since the demographic of these titles are usually kids who have to sap their single mother's credit card every year. NBA 2K especially has developed a community that strongly influences their fellow players to buy virtual currency, since it starts you off with a character that's basically unusable unless you upgrade him. But since that's what makes the money, I don't think it's going anywhere. But then of course there's also the kind of games that end up disappointing players after long waits, but honestly those are really rare and I can't name any off the top of my head. Regardless of what the games actually turn out to be like, why do these actually take so long in the first place? Well, there's a ton of reasons, of course. After all, every game and its developers are different. Some games don't really have huge development teams, and that's why it requires a lot of time to make them. Others have hundreds of people working on them, but since the game is so complex, it still takes them a while. First though, let's talk about the indie developers out there, and perhaps the most famous case of a long wait for an indie game is Deltarune. See, when Undertale released, it turned the entire gaming world upside down. You could not escape it, even so much so that MatPat gifted the game to the Pope. Now that being said, discussion around a sequel to the game was huge after its release, and I remember people really wanting it, including myself. So when Deltarune Chapter 1 released, people were sort of confused. Why did Toby Fox release an unfinished game for free? Well, it's clear that this game would be much larger than Undertale, and more of a passion project rather than a way to capitalize off the success of the original. Knowing this, releasing the game gradually made the most sense for both Toby and the fans. This way we would get a new game every 3 years or so instead of having to wait a decade for a game. The thing is, indie games getting sequels is pretty uncommon actually. I would have to assume that this is because the devs are less concerned with commercial success and more about their own enjoyment of their passion. I would also assume that working alone on a sequel to a game you've been working on for years already must be pretty exhausting. Now compare that to big studios with hundreds of employees and it would make a whole lot more sense why we don't really see that many indie sequels. I mean, do you think that there's any sort of passion behind those yearly release games? Many of these big AAA companies have been programmed to pump out games very frequently, and it doesn't really matter if the developers or the players are passionate about the games, they just need to get it out and to sell it. If there's anywhere to point to as the scum of the gaming industry, sports titles take that role. I know we're talking about why games take so long to make, but I think going into how these companies are able to put out yearly games will actually help us a lot. The most important thing we should discuss about them is how they handle their graphics and assets. The concept of reusing assets gets thrown around a lot, mostly in a negative connotation. In reality, if a game developer is able to improve and add new content, if it means reusing some old assets here and there, it's usually worth it. A major time sink of game development is making the graphical elements, and while most sports titles, for example, get face scans for their players, many of the other parts of the game are reused. This can certainly be a positive or a negative, depending on how much care the devs put into making the experience feel cohesive and unique. It's actually quite hard to find titles that don't reuse any assets from previous games, unless it's genuinely a sequel with a huge graphical jump. Some of the greatest games of all time, like The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Super Mario Galaxy 2, and even Elden Ring, all use a lot of assets from previous games. So why can these games get away with it? Well, they really made an effort into making the games feel completely different, and a lot of that comes down to putting the games in a completely new world. And now is where things come back to why games are taking so long to make these days. Many years ago, gaming worlds were a lot smaller. If we place some of these old worlds inside of new ones, it's truly truly eye-opening. And as these worlds get bigger and bigger, so does the amount of work that needs to go into making them feel full of life. A couple decades ago, games could reuse assets, add a bunch of content, and still release in a short time. This is why Majora's Mask was able to be made in like a year. Nowadays, even if games use a lot from previous titles, building a whole new map and world takes a ton of time. People love to complain about how long GTA 6 is taking to make, but they never bother to consider that this game will probably be twice as big as GTA 5, and not to mention it's also meant to last a whole nother decade. And of course I have to talk about how incredibly detailed all the locations, characters, and random events will be. Just take a look at how well Rockstar handled Red Dead Redemption 2, and it should be obvious why GTA 6 is taking this long. Hold on though, do these games even need to be this big? I understand that having a huge world to explore is amazing, and I think that there's absolutely a place for them in the gaming world. I mean, games like Breath of the Wild depend on huge maps, right? Well, not really. Just comparing the size of some of the most popular open world maps, Breath of the Wild's isn't really that large. Also, if we look at Skyrim's map, one of the most popular and highly acclaimed games of all time, it's not that big either. So perhaps the size of a lot of modern AAA games maps is much more about the spectacle rather than the content of the areas. What was so great about the more limited maps of older games was that the developers had to pack as much content as possible into a smaller map. It's quite amazing seeing how they were able to fit such interesting worlds into just a few gigabytes. Now with the popularization of SSDs and cloud storage, we basically have unlimited space, allowing developers to pad their games out as much as possible in an effort to create a game that can be played forever. In reality though, gamers are starting to see right through this, and now indie games have basically become mainstream. A lot of people see AAA developers charging $70 for a game that took way too long to make and think that the whole gaming industry is greedy, but that's not the case. Every day, new games get released by non-AAA developers, and they do quite well. I mean, for the last week, I've been obsessed with a puzzle game about a fruit, which, by the way, has been downloaded over 5 million times worldwide. And speaking of indie games, let's talk about another aspect of games that likely hinders development time significantly: music. This is one of the parts of a game that cannot have its corners cut. Music is the thing that sticks with players almost more than anything else, so you can't just drag and drop any old MP3 from an old game into a new one. Sure, some games have recurring themes and whatnot, but overall the entire soundtrack of a game will be original. That being said, the actual difficulty of making music varies greatly. Some games are much more simple, while others are amazingly complex. Certain developers may opt for a track made completely in a digital workstation, and others might need a full orchestra. On the more independent side of things, the creators of Undertale and Stardew Valley are both known for making their games almost entirely alone, including the composition of music. How they were able to manage doing both the programming and the music composition, I don't know, but it's certainly impressive. And it's not like these tracks are anything less than amazing either. But on a more medium scale of composition, the Persona games are famous for their intricate pieces of music that fit perfectly with the game's theme. And on a AAA level, Nintendo has made some amazing soundtracks, specifically the Mario Galaxy tracks that used a symphony orchestra. Regardless of the budget level, this is a huge factor in game development, and it's incredibly important for the composers and the game developers to be in close talks. After all, to make a complete experience, the music of a setting needs to fit just right. Honestly, I wonder what the whole process would be like for composers and developers staying in contact. Like, do the developers go up to them and basically give them a list of tracks they need and what they want them to sound like? I assume this is what takes a big chunk of the time up in the development process, especially with more of the narrative-driven games. Obviously, everything is divided into teams, so it's all relative, but for the more mid-range studios, I assume that the workload is actually a lot more. If we really want to simplify things down though and describe why AAA games take so long to make, it's just all about complexity. Think about all the moving parts required to make one of these big titles. Writing the narrative and scripts, making the models, designing the world, composing the music, and even motion capture is starting to become a fundamental part of modern games. Not to mention all of the bug and glitch testing that has to be done prior to the game's release. Honestly, games have become more akin to movies than anything else. It seems like the gameplay has been completely put on the back burner in order to showcase deeper stories and insane graphics. Now, I don't really have a problem with that. I mean, my favorite game of all time is probably 50% cutscenes, but I think there's a point where a game being too cinematic actually makes it too boring. The good thing is that when an extreme starts to emerge in one area of something, the other extreme will also come out. What I mean by this is that since AAA developers want to make games that take years and years to come out, we're going to see even more of a rise in the indie game market, which already has seen so much growth since games like Undertale, Stardew Valley, and even Five Nights at Freddy's emerged. So if you're fed up waiting so long for a game to come out, perhaps you should start indulging in some of the lower budget yet somehow higher quality games of the indie market.